And then my job is to try and put all of that to one side and to hone back in on the reason we're here, which is we want to learn a little bit more about Jesus. We want to encounter him this morning, and we want to leave this place a little bit more like him. But as Phil said, you know, we live in Mexborough, which is, you may or may not have heard of it, but it's the 5th largest town in South Yorkshire. It's kind of where Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster meet, and Doncaster, you know, are a bit annoyed it falls inside their borough because no one really wants it. You know, we have a Sheffield postcode, a Rotherham dial code, and we pay our council tax to Doncaster. So you can imagine we have a few identity issues in our community. And we live as a family on mission, and we're determined. You know, less than 100 people in a town of 16,000 people attend church. So we're in quite a tough place. And when you live as a family on mission, the reality is sometimes you have to do some things that are not quite as prim and proper, or you've just got to go with the flow because you're in a really tough community and in a culture that really doesn't know who Jesus is. And we've launched on a Sunday afternoon something we call Love Mexborough Sundays. And what we've decided to do, and I loved hearing about the holiday club, I've already in my head like, 4 little tents, a little tribes thing, already noting some little things down that I can copy. We've decided that we're going to have to just forget that there's adults in the room and go wholeheartedly after young kids. And we have the pleasure every Sunday of gathering about 20 young kids, none of them churched, and teaching them worship songs and teaching them the Bible. Because actually we have a very Bible illiterate generation growing up. Kids that don't know about Noah, don't know about the walls of Jericho, Moses parting the sea, that when we stand and say, you've heard this before, they're like, haven't got a clue what you're on about. So we've gone right back to basics with Genesis, and we're working our way through the Bible, and they're hearing the Bible for the first time, and seeing 20 kids who don't know what church is, jumping up and down, doing actions, singing songs, worshipping Jesus is one of the most beautiful things that we've done. But this morning we're gonna jump into the Bible, and we're going to look at one of my favourite stories in the whole of Scripture. And I'm sure many of you will have heard it before. If you haven't, I'm going to read it anyway. It's a story in Matthew 26, 6-13. And it's the story of Jesus being anointed by the woman. Many of us will have heard it, but let me read it. It says, "Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why this waste? This could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? She's done a beautiful thing for me. You'll always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for my burial. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her.'" This story, just to get some of the awkwardness of it out of the way, actually appears in all 4 Gospels, and they don't seem to match up with one another, if we're totally honest. So the couple of differences are the day that it happened. When you read it in Luke, it seems to suggest it was in the middle of Jesus' ministry, but the other 3, Matthew, Mark and John, put it in the week leading up to Jesus' death. John goes about 6 days, and I think Matthew and Mark about 2 days beforehand. There's a bit of discrepancy about where it's held. Was it Simon the leper's house? Was it Lazarus' house? There is a bit of a difference on, did they pour it on his head? Did they pour it on his feet? Did they pour it on his body? And then there's a couple of differences about the woman who poured it. Was it Mary, or was it just a random passerby? And it seems to suggest, it uses the word prostitute or sinner, so it suggests that there's some kind of immoral goings on there. But the reason I wanted to talk about them was if you go home and just Google it and you end up reading a different gospel with the message, actually, when you look at the story, I think it is commonly accepted among theologians, of which I am not one of them, it's commonly accepted that without a shadow of a doubt, Jesus was at a meal in the lead up to Passover. That a woman has come with some form of expensive ointment and has anointed Jesus at this meal. Whether it was Simon the leper or Lazarus is not a massive fact that we need to get stuck on. And it's unlikely that there was 4 different occurrences of exactly the same story over the 3 years of Jesus' ministry. So I think if we can get over those little details, rather than trying to nail down those bits and actually look at what this story tells us, I personally think this has been one of the most transformative stories of the gospel that I've ever read. That it's impacted me more than any other. So we see that Jesus is sat at a Pharisee's house and he's having this meal. And from back in my days of being an intern or a volunteer youth worker or a slave, I guess it depends on how you put that terminology and how churches use them. I look at Phil there because he was my boss at the time. But I remember that Phil had put on like this Passover meal with a couple of the other church leaders, and it showed us how people would sit at these particular meals. So you would, was it your right arm or your left arm? You would lean on your left arm and you would eat with your right arm, and then you would kind of, your feet would go down and the next person's head would be at your feet. And you would go around the table, and the place of honour was usually the host or maybe a special guest appearance, and then people would be around the table. And the further down the table you got, naturally, the less of an important role that you had. Now, the Pharisees back in the day, these are the big political players of the Jewish church and of the synagogue and the temple, and these guys, they get the nice gowns and they get the top seats at the table, and what these guys say tends to go. And people, they probably get a few perks of the job and maybe a couple of backhanders or whatever. And I recognise that I probably say that with a bit of a sarcastic, maybe dismissive opinion of the Pharisees, but that's because we know how the stories end and that they murdered Jesus. So we do tend to have a little bit of a passive, sarcastic opinion of them in many ways. But these are the big religious guys. And in fact, they're probably so religious, they forget about the Messiah their religion is pointing to. That their religiosity blinded them to the fact that the Christ who that they were spending their lives waiting for was actually sat at the table having a meal with them. They took great pleasure in pointing out people not being able to stick to the 400 odd plus laws that you had to on the Sabbath, and Jesus going and healing on the Sabbath and things like that. These guys had kind of fell out with Jesus, and we read through the Gospels that they wanted to kill him. So Jesus has gone to this house, and the custom is your feet get washed. So usually you'd go in and your feet would be washed, and it's because my feet are going to be at the next person's head, so it's probably quite nice to give them a bit of a wash, get a bit of that dust off, and they won't have been wearing any shoes as they're walking around, so I can imagine they're a little bit smelly, a little bit unclean. And the custom was to wash them and to also maybe anoint people's head with oil and to just to welcome people and show some respect. But actually when Jesus arrives at this meal, he doesn't get any of that. So he arrives at this meal and he's expected to sit down. He's expected to sit down and he doesn't get any of that treatment that every single guest would have got. And based on that, there's probably a fair assumption to make that Jesus would have been sat towards the bottom of the table because it would have been quite offensive to the next guest to have Jesus' feet at their head with him not having any kind of ceremonial washing before this meal. But one of the questions I guess I've kind of thought about this story is, why would a Pharisee invite Jesus to this meal? And for me, I figure I arrive at two different sides. So one side is, you've got this Pharisee going, do you know what? Maybe this Jesus is who he says he is. Maybe, just maybe, he is the Messiah that we've read about. So let's have him over for dinner and let's hear what he's got to say. Maybe he's like, I'm going to treat him right. I'm going to treat him well like I would every other guest. And then maybe I'm going to make a bit of a public statement that as a Pharisee, Jesus is who he said he is. Because you look at the likes of Nicodemus, who meets with Jesus in the dark night and things, and some of the Pharisees do begin to realise who Jesus is. Maybe he invites him over to humiliate him. Maybe it's because he wants to just have him over. There's a big fuss about him. I'm a Pharisee. Let's have Jesus over for dinner and let's just treat him with complete disregard and disrespect to reaffirm that message that this is a crazy guy claiming equality with God who is doing nothing but blaspheme and he deserves to die. And I think it's okay when we read the Bible to remember that there is humanity in the middle of these stories. That these are stories about real people and real events that happen. Because what happens is when we become a bit detached from them, we just skim over the letters that are on the page, and we kind of forget that actually this is God showing his love for humanity and speaking to us through it. It's important that when we maybe hit a point of going, did the Pharisee invite him over because he wanted to hear from him, or did he want to disregard him? I don't think we should be building our theology on emotive thoughts and building our understanding of who God is on what-ifs in the Bible that are just from our perspective and the human element. But I think it's okay to have them thought-provoking questions and to think, what must it have been like to be there in that moment? And the reason I think that's important is because when we actually start to look at the bigger picture of this story, we recognise the massive thing that's about to happen when this woman walks into the house. I realise this is yours, but I'm going to pinch some. Is that all right? I've known you long enough that I'm comfortable sharing a glass of water with you. So Jesus is sat at this table. This has happened, totally ignored. Pharisees are there, everything's going on, and then a woman walks in. Now, it doesn't maybe in 2023 seem like such a big deal, but let's bear in mind, a woman has walked into the room. One of the things I love about the Bible is the way that women are interacted with. You look at Paul thanking them for planting house churches. You look at Jesus saying in this particular story, this lady is going to be remembered for all of time. The church seems to be 2,000 years ahead of history in understanding kind of equality amongst men and women. And yet so often we're told that the Bible is outdated and archaic and not relevant anymore, yet in many ways, actually it's thousands of years ahead of its time and ahead of culture. So she comes in and she gets this jar of perfume, we'll call it, and she pours it on Jesus' feet. Now this jar of perfume costs a full year's wages. Now I know to a Baptist minister that's probably about £100,000, but to the rest of us, maybe about 20 grand. So she comes in and she pours. I know how the stipend works, it's all right. She comes in and she pours this perfume on Jesus' feet. And she wipes it with her hair, and it says tears are streaming down her face. So all that muck and that rubbish that's on his feet, she's now wiping that off onto her hair, and she's in tears because she's at the feet of Jesus. This woman at some point has had such an encounter with Jesus throughout his ministry that she's gone into a home of a Pharisee, that she sat at his feet, and she's poured the most expensive thing she owns on his feet and has wiped them with her own hair, and she is crying because she recognizes she sat at the feet of Jesus. It's a pretty beautiful moment and quite a powerful moment as well. And naturally, the room has sat up and took notice. People are grumbling, saying that the money could have been sold and given to the poor. And Jesus' response is this: why do you trouble the woman? She's done a beautiful thing. You'll always have the poor, you won't always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she's done it to prepare me for my burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel's proclaimed, this will be told in memory of her. So there's kind of four big statements that he brings up. She's done something beautiful. You'll always have the poor. It's prepared me for my burial. And this story will always be told where the gospel is preached. I've just realised as well, I keep saying poor. That's because now that I live in South Yorkshire and my wife is a teacher and my mother-in-law is a retired teacher, I am getting absolutely pulled apart for having a northeastern accent, and my kids are picking it up. So when I'm saying poor, she's like, now remember, Ella, it's poor. We don't say poor in this part of the country. So you'll see I've got this crazy mix of trying to hold on to my Middlesbrough accent of where I grew up, but at the same time changing the way I say some of my vowels so that my daughter isn't going into school and having this crazy Yorkshire northeastern mix of an accent while she's in there. And now that I've started working for Barnsley Council, in 12 months I have no idea what I'm going to sound like once I've got a mix of the three of them, because those guys are strong. So there's these four big statements. The first thing is Jesus says that she has done a beautiful thing. So Jesus recognizes and points out that she's come into the home, that she has felt this urgent need to dispense the most precious thing she's got at his feet, to make this public statement that you are worth my most prized possession. You are worth the one thing that could keep me financially secure. You're worth the one thing that could have fed me for the next 12 months and paid my rent. You're worth all of that. I'm going to sit at your feet and pour this out and clean your feet and anoint you, because you are worth the most ultimate physical, earthly cost that I have got. Not only that it says that she's a sinner. So she's a sinning woman, whatever that sin was, and she sat at his feet. So have you noticed he doesn't stop her? He doesn't go, whoa, I know exactly who you are, don't come near me. That actually he allows her to bring that act of worship to her. So she's burst in the room and she's determined to open this perfume. She's determined to pour it on his feet. But not only is that happening, Jesus is totally comfortable in letting her in. Totally comfortable in letting her pour it. Totally comfortable in letting her, with her hair, wipe his feet. Back in, I don't know if it's Levitical law or Deuteronomy law, whatever it is, but if an unclean woman was to touch a man, that man, even just touch his skin, that man has become unclean. Jesus doesn't seem bothered by that. He's like, anyone can sit at my feet. So she pours this out. And she's obviously had some transformational experience of Jesus where she recognizes, I've got to get to him, I've got to sit at his feet. And it provokes a question in us, in do we show that desire to worship God? That do we give him the things that cost us the most? Our money, our time, our effort. And I know Jesus is not physically around now, but do we in our families, with friends, at our workplaces, show willingness to walk into a place where Jesus is being dishonored and to do something that honors him? Is that a way that we still choose to live, remembering what it was like the first time we ever met him? Remembering how we'd have kicked down any door, we'd have poured out any perfume, we'd have done whatever it took to tell the world about the Jesus that we've encountered. Such was the transformation that happened inside of us. Such was the liberation we had when we were forgiven for our sin. Do we still live in a way that we're kicking down doors and we're pursuing to sit at his feet, even though the rest of the room is going, what are you doing? I was in some training at work recently, and we've been asked to talk about how we kind of give positive praise to people and the impact that has and things. And this woman had come to a community meal that we run every Tuesday, and she stood at the doorway. And I can see she doesn't want to come in, and I knew exactly who she was. She'd been caught performing some physical act on a gentleman in the middle of the marketplace, in the middle of the high street. And we're quite a small community, so you can imagine how quickly that's gone around social media, and you can imagine some of the response of our local community. But she turns up at our community meal. And I said to her, hey, you doing all right? And she's like shaking. She's like, have you heard? I said, of course I've heard. I was like, everybody's heard. We've all got Facebook. I was like, come on in. She's like, I don't know if I'm allowed. And it's a church building we run it out of. I was like, come on in. I said, I'll be honest with you, I'm running late cooking the meal. Can you come in and help me with the food? And I look in the kitchen and I'm like, right, what can I let her serve that isn't going to get burnt or isn't going to kill anybody? So I let her open the tins of beans and put them in the pan. I was like, no one's ever died from a tin of beans yet. I don't think. So she's there and she's doing the tins of beans, and I'm talking to her, and we're just having a conversation about the grace of God, and she's going to feel people are staring at her. She's just going to have to get over it. And she's just, she was like, I was telling her about the Bible and how God's mercy and grace is afresh every morning. And anyway, so I'm sat in this training session and I'm telling people this story, and they're looking at me going, so why would you do that? And I said, well, I'm a Christian and God's a God of grace. Why wouldn't I do that? So I noticed that I had an opportunity in a training session at work where there's working for an authority, religion and God is very much not part of any of that, to actually take my relationship with God into a room that isn't dishonouring him but isn't honouring him, and take something in where I can honour God and say, oh, this is a story of how I helped someone to do with the training we were on yesterday, and share a little bit of God's love with the wider team who maybe have no understanding of who that is. And the beauty of it was 2 people came to me afterwards from that room and said, oh, I'm a Christian too. This is the church I go to in Sheffield, or this is the church that I belong to in Barnsley or Doncaster or wherever it was. And it was nice to know that actually if we take a moment to honour God in different situations where we feel that he's maybe not in the centre of it, you'd be surprised at the way the room sits up and listens or notices what it is that we're doing. The second statement that Jesus says is that you'll always have the poor. So he realises the cost of the perfume. He totally understands what it could have been sold to buy, but he reassures her that there'll always be an opportunity to do the right thing. So he says you'll always have the poor with you. You'll always be able to give money to the poor. You'll always be able to do them things, but you won't always have me. And right now, in this particular moment, the most logical, methodical, earthly thing to do might have been to sell that and to give that away. But the beautiful and right thing to do was to use that moment to worship and honour me. And I know it might kind of be a little bit far-fetching of an analogy, but I was walking down the high street in a little town called Wunwell, where one of the offices I work in is based, and I had a kid's electric bike thing, like a little police bike that you put your foot down and it goes, because Jensen's outgrown it. And I thought, oh, I'll go and give it to the charity shop and they can, you know, sell it. Some kid can get it. And as I'm walking there, I see this woman with a little boy who must have been 18 months old. So I walked up to her and I said, oh, excuse me. I was like, would your kid like this? And naturally, you know, you don't take things from strangers in the middle of the high street. So she was a little bit like, what do you want? I was like, honestly, nothing. I said, I'm just going to give this to the charity shop. And to be honest, you probably would walk in and maybe buy it. So rather than you paying for that, why don't you just have it? And she's like, oh, thank you so much. Anyway, the boy's sitting on it, tearing around. And I said to her, oh, have you heard of Huff Lane Church? And she went, oh yeah, Together Church, I've heard of them, they're really good, I've seen all the things you do. I said, well, I don't go there personally. I said, but I know the guys who lead it. I said, and it's a great place. I said, do me a favour. I said, will you just take your little boy one Sunday and just let him have some fun? And she was like, absolutely, of course I will. I don't know if she'll ever go, because it's not my town, it's not my church. And maybe that's a bit of a loose analogy, but actually, I'll always have an opportunity to give something to a charity shop where they can sell it and make a couple of quid and have that knock-on effect. But equally, there'll always be them opportunities that we can do something where actually, I want to do this as an act of worship to God. I want to give this straight to that woman and just say, come along to church, God recognises you're here. Like I see you and God sees you as well. And I think from that reaction that Jesus gives, I guess some of the questions for that would be, do we take care of the poor? Do we live with a radical generosity? But do we actually do what this woman did, that when it doesn't make sense, we worship Jesus no matter what the cost? Because a full year's wages is an awful lot of money, especially when we continuously hear about the economical crisis that we're in and the cost of mortgages and gas and electric and all this stuff. It becomes even harder when it's money related. Jesus says that he'd prepared her for a burial. Now this one I find really fascinating. So everyone's absolutely fuming at this woman. So she's poured this perfume on his feet. She's wiped his hair and stuff. And Jesus has said, she's prepared me for my burial. So without recognizing it, this woman has walked into a room, poured some perfume, and not knowing it, she has just done something with eternal significance because she's just prepared Jesus for his burial. She had no idea that he was going to be crucified and buried. Jesus is continually telling the disciples and they don't get it. And yet she comes in and does what we think is a trivial act of pouring some perfume, but has actually just fed into the eternal story that God is building of his son coming, dying and being resurrected for our sin. Which then makes me think, wow, how many times have we done something and never known the eternal impact that our little act of worship has had on somebody else's life? We, when we started Love Mexborough, we literally put on a movie morning once a month for like 6 months. Trivial little thing, showed some Disney films because we like Disney films and we thought, how can we connect with other families in our community? Amazingly, in those 6 months, we had a family turn up, a woman with 4 kids who had been part of a huge church split and got lost in the middle of that church split. Disgraceful behaviour amongst some of the leaders of that church, and she got lost in the middle of that. Because of a movie morning, a trivial little thing where we just tried to do something for the goodness of God to share a little bit of the story of Jesus, she's now back in a church, baptised, and so is one of her 4 daughters. All we did, stuck on a Disney film. Another lady turns up at our thing, says to me, I've not left the house for 2.5 years because I suffer with really bad panic attacks and anxiety. Saved and baptised. All because we just put a movie morning on. And sometimes when we're doing things that we want to say are an act of worship, we're looking for this big moment or the bright lights and the clouds of smoke. And actually God's like, if you just do the little things, it might look insignificant to you. It might be pouring a bit of perfume on my feet, sticking a movie morning on, but you have no idea the eternal impact that this could have, because God isn't so linear in the way that he thinks like we are, but actually the way that sometimes I see the kingdom of God is like a symphony, that it's all different instruments playing at the same time, and it's only when they all come in unison do we see a revival or an awakening. And that actually you have no idea that what you did might have been one of them little notes that saw someone encounter Jesus and go on and be a missionary somewhere, feed hungry people, listen to readers in schools, be a cleaner in a care home that shares the love of God with everybody she encounters. You have no idea of the internal impact that your small act of worship can have on somebody. And when we start to live like every little act of worship could be something eternal, it changes how much effort we put into those smaller little things when we recognize the bigger picture that we're a part of. Then Jesus says finally, this will be spoken about. This blows my mind. He's in the house of either Simon the leper or Lazarus. Simon the leper had leprosy, yeah? So if Jesus is in the house and it is Simon the leper, what does that mean? He must have been healed of leprosy, because ain't nobody going to a house party at a leper's house because they're all going to catch leprosy. I would say that's quite a significant story, wouldn't you? Have we all heard of Lazarus before? And what happened to Lazarus? He was raised from the dead. So a woman walks into the room, pours some perfume on Jesus' feet, and the story that's going to be remembered and preached about whenever the gospel is shared is not the man healed of leprosy, is not Lazarus raised from the dead, is the woman who pours perfume on his feet. How have we got to that point? Because let's be honest, we all want to see leprosy healed and the dead raised more than we want to see someone pour a little bit of perfume. And as I pondered that and thought about that, I guess it made me recognize that actually Lazarus and Simon, they were both physically healed of something. Yet this woman, to come in and pour this perfume at his feet, to have tears streaming down her face, to wipe his feet with her hair, she had been internally, spiritually transformed. She had encountered who Jesus was and was now living on a completely different trajectory, there we go, trajectory than before. That it's the spiritual transformation that will echo through eternity more than the physical healing. But we wouldn't have expected it to be that way around. And for me, the whole ethos of this story is that we, as a group of Christians, a group of people wanting to be a disciple, is that we need to get to a point, and this has always been the mantle of everything we've done at Love Mexborough, is that we need to do what we can, where we are, with what we have. God expects nothing more. Just to do what we can, where we are, with what we have. To recognize and understand that the trivial and the insignificant could be hugely prophetic and kingdom advancing, and we would have no idea. And then the real reason that this story is my favourite story in the whole of the Gospels is this. And I know I'm sounding a little bit repetitive, but hopefully it drives the point home. The woman walks in the room. She's not allowed in there. Jesus has been dishonoured. She comes to his feet. They're probably dirty. She pours her perfume on them and she wipes them with her hair. Whatever it costs, I am going to worship him. I don't care what they say about me. I don't care how they treat me, because nothing they can do to me can undo what he has done for me. But then here's the most beautiful moment of the whole story. She pours the perfume on Jesus' feet, and Jesus smells like the perfume. She sits at his feet and she wipes his feet with her hair, and she smells like the perfume. The room smells of the perfume. That in those moments where we do the little act of worship, we smell just like Jesus. that the woman smelt like Jesus at the end of this story. That her act of worship, not only did she smell like Jesus, the whole fragrance of the room smelled of the encounter of worship that had just happened in front of them all. That when we choose to live like that, the room can't help but look. When we choose to live like that, we can't help but smell like him. And I'm fairly convinced that as people left this room and people went about their lives, they would have told this story. I know it sounds silly, but you know when you go into like Boots and there's all the make-uppy bits and all of that, every time I walk past the Estee Lauder bit, I always get a whiff of a perfume called Knowing. And without a shadow of a doubt, straight away I think of my grandma. Because that's the perfume my grandma would always wear. So when we'd go and stay over on a weekend, and then mum and dad would be coming to pick us up, and grandma and granddad were getting ready to go out, she would put that perfume on and come downstairs. And I know exactly the smell of my grandma based on that perfume. That actually, as these people went away, every time they smelt that smell of the perfume this woman brought, what would they remember? They would remember that moment in that room where she did that act of worship. You wouldn't have been able to get it out of your nostrils. And if it cost a year's wages, we're not talking a couple of sprays out of a bottle. We're talking she poured the full lot on him, and the whole room carried the fragrance of worship. That actually we can live in such a way that when we do something, that we plant a seed, that it changes someone's life, that we might not see the fruit and the impact of it there and then, but actually going forward, there may be a moment in their life, the next time they're hungry and they need a loaf of bread, they go, oh, do you remember when those guys from the church did this for me? Because we live with a way of thinking of that internal significance, not just the big wow factor in the things that we do to worship. So the questions that we carry away this morning would be, what do we have that we can lay at his feet? And I would really honestly encourage you to spend time this coming week asking God, what can I lay at your feet that will change the fragrance of the room in the places I find myself? What can I do that will make a room smell like you? And then I too would be part of that. How can we live with radical generosity, radical grace, radical love, radical obedience? And do we dare to believe that we could live in a way that maybe one day our story would be retold? Because I think if we lived in a way that our story is retold, it would change the way we live. It would change the way I parent. If I thought every time I got it wrong with my kids, my story was going to be retold, it would certainly change the way that I parent my kids. Would it change how we are as employees? As husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, daughters, parents, friends? That if we said, you know what, I'm going to take every moment as an act of worship, no matter how trivial it might look, believing there'll be some eternal significance to this, knowing that in this moment I will look like him and smell like him and him like me, and that the room will carry the fragrance of worship. Let's pray. Father, our prayer is really simple this morning. Could we live in a way that we would look more like your Son? Could we live in a way that we, as individuals in this room, longing to be the best disciples that we can be, longing to live to the fullness of life that you tell us is available for us? Could we look more like your Son? That when we want to ask ourselves the questions, what does God think about this? We simply open up the Gospels, we see how Jesus responds in them situations, and we see what you think. That when we see the hungry, we would feed them. When we see the widows and the orphans, we would take care of them. When we see the marginalized and the left out, we would include them. Would you also let us live, Father, in a way that we would give complete worship to you, no matter what the cost? Whether it be a physical thing, a financial thing, a time thing, a relational thing, Father, let us come and lay at your feet the one thing that costs us the most. so that where a room is not honouring of you, we would bring the honour that you deserve, and that we would bring the attention back to Jesus, even if he's sat at the bottom of the table or forgotten and not even invited to the party, that we would have a boldness to take in a jar of ointment, to lay it at your feet, that we would weep knowing what you have done for us, sharing your story, that you would do it for others too. Father, don't let us leave this place just thinking, oh, it's a nice little story with a bit of emotion and we feel good. But let us go home and this week ponder the thoughts and points that maybe sit on our heart or that we keep going over in our mind, that you would speak to us through them, that over this week we wouldn't have just heard a sermon and walked away, but we would have been challenged by God to live more like his Son, filled with his Spirit, going into all of the world, making disciples. Amen.